Hello, I'm Russell Sturgis. I'm the founder and principal of the Centre for Western Mindfulness. Welcome to the second blog in the series that I'm doing in 2022 on forgiveness. In the first in this series, I discussed the idea of loving your enemies and identified 10 ways for approaching forgiveness that would make loving your enemies a reality. Well, it turns out that these same 10 forgiveness tools will be fundamental for transforming all of the things that interfere with our capacity to sustain inner peace and love as a way of life. In the written blog this month, I focus on the need to consciously adopt the spiritual values of love and peace as a way of sustainably being more forgiving. So if you have replaced material values or what was referred to in the Sermon on the Mount as the values of mammon, if you've replaced those with sustainable spiritual values, divine values, then forgiveness is a natural response to injustice. As it explains, you can't do both. You can't be aligned with material values and with spiritual values. You can't be aligned with mammon and God, as it refers to it in that old language. And so at some stage, you've got to make a choice. And of course, a choice comes off the back of being informed. In terms of adopting forgiveness, if you're already aligned with spiritual values, that becomes quite easy. It's something that's just a natural extension of having really aligned yourself with joy, peace, and love as the things that you value most and the things that you want to have as your expression of life. But it's difficult to do. And it's hard to sustain if your values are caught up in the material world. So today, I want to talk about what it takes to make that shift from unsustainable values to sustainable values. In short, it's achieved through living mindfully, and the Pathways to Mindfulness program, which is the core tool of the Centre for Western Mindfulness, is designed to just do that. What we do is we help people develop a mindful approach to life, and as such, forgiveness becomes the living breath of life aligned with spiritual values. So in other words, it's sort of just in the same way as we breathe naturally in order to function from minute to minute, day to day. Forgiveness becomes the natural breath of being aligned with sustainable values. Now, if we bring it down to its simplest understanding, in each moment, we can either function mindfully or habitually. So we're either conscious or we're subconscious. And there's a lot of research that actually is showing that we function subconsciously 95% of the time and only 5% of the time when we're truly conscious. And mindfulness is an expression of consciousness, is remembering in each moment that you have a choice to be kinder to yourself and others. That's the Centre for Western Mindfulness definition of mindfulness, is remembering in each instant that you have a choice to be kinder to yourself and others. Whereas living habitually is being on autopilot, doing what you were programmed to do, getting the same results, although in many cases hoping for something different. To be motivated to change your operating system, whether that's habitually to becoming more mindful oriented, requires a trigger that in many cases in some form is a form of suffering. So in other words, in order for us to want to make a change, many of us wait until we're hurting. And in terms of the four truths in Buddhism, Buddha sort of stated that there were four fundamental truths, and the first of those is that we suffer. That's part of the human experience. The second is we suffer because of what we're attached to. That means we suffer because of what we value. That was his second principle of the four truths. The third one is that we can change, and the fourth one is that we can do it now. And that's what we're talking about today. The problem that we have today is that we lack good spiritual role models, and any that existed maybe in the past were tied up with religion, and religion's really created its own problem by virtue of not honouring, particularly in terms of Christianity, those real principles of being merciful and forgiving and all the things that we saw as spiritual virtues and spiritual values have been replaced by the material ones, which is about greed and wealth and power and all those sorts of things. So with that lack of spiritual guidance, or that lack of mentoring around how people can be aligned with spiritual values, in order to cope, since they can't be relieved of their suffering, in order to cope with their suffering, people revert to medication, recreational drugs, consumerism, alcohol, all sorts of other addictions that they may have, that literally become a distraction that either helps them to either avoid experiencing pain and suffering, or numbs them to that, as opposed to helping them become free of those things. And of course, invariably, when those things are sustained over a long period of time, people end up with either long or slow suicide, but invariably death, as the consequence of being in this place of sustained suffering. So what we teach at the Centre for Western Mindfulness, and what is fundamental to sustainable change, is that you have to be the observer of your unsustainable values, and these include things like wealth and power, romantic love and success. And you have to be able to observe not only those things, but how they're impacting on your life. There's an adage that says you can't change what you can't see. That's why in the Christian scriptures, Jesus said, if you can see with your eyes, hear with your ears, and understand with your heart, I will heal you. So when you think about those things, seeing with your eyes, that's an act of observation. Hearing with your ears is an act of observation. Understanding with your heart is an emotional act of observation. So even he subscribed to this notion that when we're able to become committed to this place of being the observer of our suffering, then we have the capacity for things to begin to change. One of the things that happens when you stay the observer is that you actually stop identifying with the thoughts and feelings that are associated with either abundance or scarcity around those things. You can't be the observer and then get caught up in thoughts and feelings that come out of your filters around whether things are good or bad. They just don't go together. And so as you become more and more of the observer, the less meaning you give to scarcity and abundance. You observe those things. And even to the point, if thoughts and feelings do emerge as a result of those experiences, as the observer, you can observe those thoughts and feelings without attributing a judgment to them. So I have grief. I have loss, I have shame, and that it's associated with the way in which I am attached to a certain person or a certain thing or a certain situation. And that's about stating the facts. And that's literally what the observer is doing, is that they're stating the facts of what's going on and then putting a full stop at the end of the facts. There's no comma, which then allows them to go on and give it a meaning. Because any meaning that we attribute to it will be a direct result of the filters that we have from our own experience. And once you've been able to bring the level of being the observer to that place, then you can move into an expanded sense of being the observer. Any response that you have to an experience, whether it's painful or delightful, is the direct result of the value that you placed on what has occurred. And I want you to just hear this for a second. Nothing that we experience in and of itself has a value, only the value that we give it. That's evidenced in two people having the same experience, but experiencing the experience differently. As Anais Nin said, we experience the world as we are, not as it is. So when you begin to understand that it's your stuff that's being projected onto what's happening in terms of around the values, that's the basis of how you experience that. The next level of observation is to look at where that comes from. Where does my stuff come from? And of course, most of the filters that we have for life's experiences are established in our formative years. It's the programming of our family and our society, our culture, that has us see the world in the way that we do. The Jesuits had a saying, give me a boy until he is 7 and I'll give you the man. And so what we have is a whole lot of programming that now becomes the focus of our observation. And so I begin in this place to start to recognize that how I relate to money was a direct result of what was going on in my childhood. How I relate to special relationships, lovers or partners, was the direct result of the way in which I was programmed to see relationship in my formative years. How I relate to work and how I relate to study and how I relate to possessions. All of these things we begin to realize are a direct result of how we were programmed. So the more we, once again, in just the same way that being the observer frees you from the feelings and the thoughts that are associated with an injustice, being the observer also frees you from the distortion of the 7-year-old. So in other words, as we stay the observer, we stop attributing the programmed meaning that we have for things, and we just observe things for what they are. This is where the principle of quantum physics appears, that when something is observed, it changes. Our challenge with that is that we are so programmed around the idea that for things to be different, they have to be fixed or interfered with, or there has to be some effort being put into manipulating the variables in order for change to happen. Whereas what this is saying is that when you can sit in the place of being the observer, you allow a new manifestation to appear by virtue of the fact that you're not locked into your old programming. You know, if the adage that if I always do what I've always done will always get me what I've always got is true, then the inverse must be true as well. If I stop doing what I have always done, then something new can manifest. And that's literally the quantum physics approach to change, is if I stop doing what I've always done, and the way that you do that is by becoming the observer, then something new can manifest. Mindfulness is more than just being the observer, though. And in the context of the Centre for Western Mindfulness, it's about remembering that you have a choice to be kinder to yourself and to others without being compelled to make the choice. That's a really important part as it relates to this extension of mindfulness being more than the observer. And I just want to reiterate this. It's remembering that you have a choice to be kinder to yourself and to others without being compelled to make a choice. The fruit of turning up in the world being kinder is inner peace and love. So these are these sustainable values, the spiritual values. Being aware that these are the benefits, one will more likely choose to act with kindness. So in other words, when you become aligned with sustainable values of joy, love, and peace, then you're going to be more inclined to want to act with kindness. And so it's in this place of being aware of the choice and making the decision to act with kindness that sees forgiveness emerge. And so this shift in consciousness will see you more consistently choose to love your enemies, bless them that curse you, and do good to those that hate you. So when we've started to choose to be aligned with joy, peace, and love as the values that we have as being important, then we will want to practice being more forgiving. And so these things that I'm talking about over this next year in terms of these different dimensions of how we can turn up being more forgiving is what is able to sustain our ability to live with inner peace, with joy and love as a way of life. Thanks for touching base again, and look out for our next in the series of forgiveness blogs that will be presented in the following month. Take care. Speak to you again soon.